light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. With me on the show today, I have my friend Vendella Sawyer.
Yes.
And the topic we wanted to wrestle with today, I guess, perhaps wrestle with is the best way to describe it, because as usual, we're only going to scratch the surface. There's so much to be said. Boundaries, expectations, and familial definitions.
Yes.
I grew up in a world where a big part of getting along with other people was to understand personal boundaries. And that if you crossed those boundaries and were imposing on another person, you were being rude. I don't know whether that kind of sense of personal space is taught anymore.
I don't believe it is. In no way whatsoever. You just take, for example, if you're driving a car
Mm-hmm.
and someone cuts you off, people are just, you would usually say, back when we were growing up, okay, that person passed me. You might say a few words to yourself. But people now get out of their car, chase the person down, and confront them just because they passed them. I mean, even if it's not anything that was dangerous, you can say, okay, they passed me, I'm fine, I'll get over it. But we just don't have any boundaries right now, to me, as far as I see.
The phenomenon of road rage.
Right.
Well, and the other thing, I guess, when I was growing up, I don't know that people would cut you off in traffic as much as they do now. I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm just saying it didn't happen as much.
Right.
Because there was this sense of mutual respect for each other. And the less we respect each other, the less we drive like we respect each other when we're in traffic.
Well, you can take it from another subject. Okay, you take the old black and white movies.
Okay.
Okay. When you watch the movie, the husband and the wife slept in separate beds.
Thanks
Okay.
to the Hollywood censors.
Right. Okay. And now, everything is open. Well, okay, we have babies, everybody's together, they're in one bed. But when we were watching TV, we're in the 50s and 60s, the wife slept in one bed and the father slept in the other bed. And if you were a kid, you were wondering, well, when did they ever get together? Or what happened?
Well, that's assuming you knew any of how babies are made and so forth.
Well, but see, now you've also the change and difference, too. Where I was coming up, you never asked my parents anything until you got 13, 14, or 15. The average 3-year-old, 4-year-old...
You didn't ask them any questions.
I didn't ask them any questions about relationships.
Okay.
Why between boys and girls.
Parental advice is reserved for after age 15.
Right. And now, the average, my granddaughter, 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
She goes to school the first day and she kisses a boy on the cheek. She's in the office.
Okay.
Nothing like that would have ever happened with me growing up at that time. And it's the influence of computers, the environment of how their parents,
extreme violence on television,
and their parents, and what they watch, what they listen to, all of these things.
And I would say also the lack of familial engagement.
Correct.
When you become a house full of strangers, there's not a lot of strong bonds or mutual respect to build on.
Well, I don't know about when you were growing up, but do you remember ever not sitting down having dinner with your family together?
In my house, we did away with family meal times by the time I was 10.
By the time you were 10.
It just never happened.
Our household, it was all the way until we were 20. We sat down, we had dinner together. We might not have lunch, and then breakfast may be different because we had to go to school. But we always had dinner
Part of our
together.
problem was that in the interest of maintaining a superficial pretense of peacefulness, we weren't allowed to talk about anything that mattered. So any discussion that had two opinions, we were immediately told to drop the subject because no one wanted to risk an argument. And so everything was very, very peaceful in a cemetery sort of way, if you understand what I mean by that.
Yes.
But we were a house full of strangers who didn't really know each other. Going one step further beyond our immediate families, though, when we talk about boundaries and familial expectations and so forth, it sounds so horrific to say it now, but there were regional subcultures throughout the United States
Yes.
where molestation and domestic violence were considered normal for many, many years. You know, if the wife didn't do what the husband wanted to, he was expected to hit her. If the kids didn't do what they were supposed to, it was a punishment so severe that they would be in pain for hours. I think going the other way, where there is no punishment, is probably not the answer, because rules need to have teeth in order for them to be respected. But clearly previous generations went way, way overboard. That was defined as normal at that time. To the best of my knowledge, it's not defined as normal anymore.
Well, I'll agree with you on that because I'm 57. Okay, so
Mhm.
the things that my parents had me do, as I got older and had my own family, I kept certain restrictions with my children, but I explained to my children more than my parents explained to me.
Okay.
I made things aware to my children more than my parents did to me. I made sure personally myself that my children and any other children in the family that were involved with me were open to knowing other things. If they wanted to go to the beach, they went to the beach. I know people who live right in California or on the Pacific coast or the Atlantic coast, and they can be 2 hours away from the beach and their children have never been there.
And they're 2 hours from the beach.
They're 2 hours from the beach.
Okay. Which, to you, that's very, very close.
That's close.
Then the hometown I grew up in, there was a lake 15 minutes outside of town that we almost never went to, because it was like the world stopped at the town limits. And if you went beyond that, well, that required a special occasion. We almost never went there, and there were shopping malls in Madison 45 minutes away, but we went to that maybe once a year. I mean, it was very. But then when I went to New York City after high school, it was a similar sort of thing, except there were people who lived their entire lives within a few city blocks.
One lived in Brooklyn and another one had never been to Queens.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it depends.
And in a sense, it's boundaries, but it's different than boundaries. It's perceptual limitations where what is beyond that, it's like it's not completely real.
But you have to still remember, like I made the I've said, you've got to have a past, you got to have a future.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're either going to completely follow your past, or you're going to make changes in your generation with your children and the people that you're around.
Okay.
It's like saying, okay, I've never rode a motorcycle.
You've never ridden a motorcycle, you
Let's
said?
just say I've never ever ridden a motorcycle,
Okay.
but I want to. But I know several friends that have one, but I won't infringe upon them to say, could you please give me a ride? Because I'm afraid I will offend them or go over my boundaries with them as a friend.
You would offend them by being too intrusive into their personal space.
Yes.
Okay.
So society nowadays is, children learn more from other children. They learn from television. They
Well,
learn
and
from,
sometimes they learn too much.
that's my point. And they're not having any guidance with it. It's like, okay, when I was coming up, when you got home, you did your homework.
Mm-hmm.
Saturday, you stayed out until maybe 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, depending on the summertime. Kids going to school
In the afternoon?
in the afternoon.
Okay.
But nowadays, if you notice with the younger generation, like my nieces and nephews, I mean, their kids are out 8, 9. It can be a school night. They're still out playing because it's still light.
Yeah, and school nights you were expected to be in bed at a reasonable hour so
And
you wouldn't be
homework
tired
done.
the next day. And homework done. I usually stayed ahead of the homework curve
So
as far
there's
as
no
that goes.
boundaries with this new generation that I see.
But no
the
chores, no responsibilities.
No. And then it's
You
always,
know, and we're making big broad statements, so obviously there are some out there that still do this.
oh yes, of course.
But it has fallen off of being the predominant norm.
Right.
And so on one hand, you have dysfunctional families that are replicating everything from incest to physical abuse. But in addition to that, you also have this level of psychological abuse. The problem with psychological abuse is that because there's no bruises, there's no blood, there's no broken bones, it becomes very difficult for people who have experienced that to convince anyone that it really happened.
Well, I give you another example. The average kid now between, let's say, 5 to 10
Okay?
has listened so much to what the government has said, what teachers say, what they hear on television. It's like if you say, well, Johnny, I'm going to punish you because you did so and so and so.
Mm-hmm.
Not a physical punishment, just a verbal, or you have to stand in the corner for 10 minutes. Well, you just can go ahead and do that. I can dial 911 and tell me you're abusing me. There are so many parents who experience that now from their kids.
Yeah. A friend of mine ran into that. His sister, he said, ran in that situation with one of his nieces, and she made that threat, and he said from that point on, she never had full parental authority again because she was always afraid of being turned in. And I said, well, I understand that there are parents who do abuse and they need to be found and the situation needs to be dealt with appropriately. If there are youth who are abusing the system against their parents, however, as a parent, that's where I would have said to her, make your choice well. Because if you really want to be a ward of the foster system, I will sign you over to the state. And you can make that choice if you want. But if you're going to live in my house, these are the rules, this is how you will behave, this is the authority you will respect. And, but that's on the understanding, and in his case it was, his sister was not abusing her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
It was simply something that the daughter was told at school, and that she wanted to use as leverage against her mother in a way that she could manipulate her mother, and she did.
Well, my own daughter tried that with me. She knew
How did you handle it?
Oh, mine was basically the same answer you said. Okay, you don't want to live here anymore. You don't want to follow the rules, and you want to report me. Okay, pack your suitcase. Let me help you. And we're getting in the car. Well, where are we going? Well, we're going to social services where you want to be because you want to follow their rules and not mine. So as we're pulling out of the driveway.
Oh, you got that far?
Oh, yeah, I got that far because she was that stubborn sometimes. Okay. And I went well, if you want to carry it all the way, I will. And my son is going, but I didn't do anything wrong. And he's the older one.
Okay.
He's 3 years older than his sister.
And you assured him that you were not taking him to social service?
He couldn't get that because he has short-term memory. But
okay.
He kept going, Mom, I didn't do anything. Mom, I didn't do anything. And she's going, I'm going. She's not going to do it. I went like, okay. So as the car hits the street, she finally realizes, listens, and says, you're really going to do it. Mm-hmm. Mama, please don't. I says, well, I don't want to have this conversation with you again. And that lasted for a while. She tried it one more time. I said, I'll have to say it. I drove to the hospital. And I told them to...
You drove her to the hospital?
I drove her to the hospital, emergency room, and says, you need to stay right here. I'm sitting in the car, and I'm calling social services to come and get you.
And whatever abuse you say is happening, the medical professionals will have to corroborate, and if they cannot find the evidence...
Right. That's why I drove to the hospital. And then after we did that, that didn't come up anymore.
Okay.
And this is when she's about 12. and then 14. You know, she's finding out she's a teenager and stuff. But my point making is, you have to, if you even have a child that has autism or any other type of disability, you have to give them boundaries and
Oh, absolutely.
and teach them
And
what is expected of them in society and how they're expected to behave.
mm,
And then you have to deal when they have their meltdowns. And my son has his meltdowns even now.
mm.
And he's 38.
And there are constructive ways of being a nurturing parent through those times.
Right.
But it is not, a disability is not an excuse for
Having your way or
it does not excuse bad behavior.
correct.
There was a small town I lived in for a short time in which there was, in my opinion, a horrendously neglectful mother who would send her children over to the park across the street and insist that, oh, I'm watching them out the kitchen window. And I kind of thought, oh, sure you are. And while they're over there, one of the three who was diagnosed with autism from time to time would basically yell to the entire park, don't anybody look, I'm peeing. And I just said, no, autism is not an excuse for public urination. As a mother, you have a responsibility to teach your child to do better than that. And if your child has that kind of lapse in judgment, he probably should not be there on his own.
Correct.
But, and I don't mean to be heavy-handed on parents, that's not the point of this discussion. It's recognizing that there is accountability, and there are boundaries, and there are expectations. And they can be used very abusively, or they can be used very constructively.
Well, it's
For the
time.
children, for the people who find themselves in abusive situations, though, how do you reestablish boundaries when somebody in the family isn't, quote, playing by the rules?
That's
Do you
where,
call social services?
if I find a family that's not doing right? Is that what you're asking me? If I know of someone who's abusing their child?
If you know of someone, or if the person in that family experiences this and wants help and can't find it within their own family, do they pick up the phone and call social services? I think you and I both know our systems are not very effective.
No, they don't.
It may be all we have, but they're
That's
not
a
very
lot.
effective.
Me, I'm the type of person that speaks my mind, and I will talk to the person about what I may be seeing.
Okay.
And I will allow that for some time. But when I think it's gotten past that, you are not paying attention, you are not going to change,
Mhm.
then I think there's a proper way for me as a person to go to the authorities and explain the situation from what I've seen
Okay.
and tell it that way. And I don't want them to come in and kick the door down and come get the kid, because that's you know, there's a
Well,
way to properly do
There
it.
are civilized ways of doing investigation.
Well,
But, you know, at the same time, I was in this situation a couple years ago of a young man who looked to be maybe 8 or 9, who was regularly wandering up and down the street with no adult supervision, acting out horrendously violent scenes with an oversized teddy bear, and on one occasion was locked out of the house with no coat or anything, and it was probably 40 degrees outside. I called up the county social services and I just said, I think there's a case here that needs some investigation. And they immediately accused me of being a meddling neighbor who was trying to cause trouble for these people, instead of considering that maybe there's something they should look at.
I ran into a situation about 3 or 4 months ago where there was an event where there were children and adults. There was a little girl.
A 3-year-old little girl,
A
okay?
3-year-old little girl who was with her grandparents and her parents.
Okay.
They decided, well, I assumed, and everyone else did, that the little 3-year-old got in the fountain in the public place where we were and took off her own clothes. And we come to find out when we're trying to tell the parents and the grandparents who are paying no attention that they're the ones that removed the 3-year-old's little clothes. And we're talking about little boys that are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12, and grown men around, and women. And the parents and the grandparents totally thought it was something that was cute.
To have a 3-year-old girl
With
playing in
nothing-
a public fountain
with nothing
nude
on.
in the presence of a
Group
mixed
of-
gender population.
Right. There was nothing wrong. That wasn't cute. Not in this day and time. That to me was unexcusable.
I guess I wouldn't think it was appropriate unless there was some kind of communal agreement that it was appropriate.
There was no other child doing this.
Well, I mean, being the only one is your first clue that maybe we're outside the boundaries here. I know there are nude beaches and nude saunas in Europe where families go as a whole, but it's an entirely different cultural and social context. That is not the situation you were just describing.
No.
And so on one hand, I think society needs to update itself, and on the other hand, we have to respect, at least to a degree, what the norms are so that we know, for lack of a better term, just how shocking we're being.
Right. But
Do you mean to be that shocking, or do you just mean to push the envelope a little bit?
But it was the reaction of the people. There were a group of 10 or 15 that were appalled and
Okay.
left the area. And then there was those that were still continually talking about it. But
Did any of them approach the parents or grandparents?
Yes, they did.
And the parents and grandparents said, "Don't bother
Oh,
us"?
that's fine. We do that all the time.
I guess that's the point at which I would have called the administrators of the park or something and said, there's inappropriate behavior happening here. It's not an emergency, but it's inappropriate, and we need enforcement of park rules, which I think precludes anyone skinny dipping in the fountain.
Well, actually, someone did make an anonymous call.
Okay?
And the police officer came through, and he drove by, and he kept going.
Didn't do anything.
No.
Oy vey. That's a whole nother discussion for another show, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so.
Kind of like me trying to walk my service dog, and I can't because there's too many loose dogs in the neighborhood. That he's been attacked twice already. I can't risk a third attack.
Mine's been attacked once.
Yeah, and I would love to call animal control, but the first thing I know he's going to say is there's nothing I can do about it.
But we have laws that are in place for that, but they're not being enforced.
Yes. And that's where I come back to the unfortunate, I mean, it sounds kind of lame to say, but the unfortunate final statement of, until discontent reaches critical mass, nothing will change.
You're right.
Until there's enough of us who decide we've had enough and this is not right, and you do need to respect us, and doggone it, behave in public.
Well, maybe this conversation that we're having will affect someone, and someone else will do something about it too.
It's a dialogue that needs to go on, but it's also the citizens making their wishes known to their elected representatives, and if their elected representatives will not listen, voting them out of office. You know, it only takes a certain number of signatures to remove virtually any politician in the country from office. We can find out how many signatures, I mean, if it's important enough, we can find out how many signatures it takes and do it. Because it's that the expectations and the boundaries and the familial definitions, it's all about relational agreements, that we communicate enough that we know what is okay and what is not. And if we're not sure, we continue to communicate about it until we come to a conclusion.
Well, hopefully people come to a conclusion very soon.
Thank you for wrestling with this complex topic today. I guess the one other thing I if we can touch on just very briefly before we go, is the whole thing of questioning parental authority. First problem with that is that most people have not really been taught how to be parents. We either, whatever we observe in our parents may be the only reference we have, and in some cases that is not a particularly good reference. And there's books and books and books and books of information that have been learned about parenting and about child development and about communal relationships. All this information that is available to us now that wasn't available 30 years ago.
My answer to you on that is that our children that are growing up now are raising themselves. Their parents aren't raising them.
Mm.
Their parents are still too wrapped up in their own. I mean, okay, I have 3 kids. I did that. I'm providing food, clothing, shelter, everything else. I think they should learn on their own because I don't have time for that. I'm too self-involved in myself. So the kids are raising themselves.
You're saying that satirically,
Satirically.
not seriously.
Both. Children are being raised on their own.
But do you want them to be raised on?
No, I don't. They know better. They know what's right and they know what's wrong.
But
But
they
honey,
know
we
what's
can-
right and wrong, but you still don't want them raised on their own without a good parental
They
influence.
need they need to have a good parental base. But now you can have just my family. My nieces and nephews come out of a good background. And the things that would be not tolerated in my house or my
Yeah.
mother's is totally different because they felt, as my niece put it to me, that we were too strict when we weren't. We were less strict than our parents were.
So, in summary, it's striking a balance between permissiveness and involvement.
Right.
Thank you very much for everything you shared today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.